Talking about colonial prisoners of war, we got a little bit of a start on this yesterday, but we'll finish it up. We told you that after the Revolutionary War in the South, as it was raging in the South, thousands of colonial soldiers are being held prisoners of war. They've been captured from basically every theater of the war so far. They are locked on 16 retired British warships. These ships are anchored in the East River by New York. The masts, the canvas, the rigging have all been taken off of these ships. The gun ports, which used to hold cannons, have been sealed shut. And we mentioned yesterday that these ships in their glory days carried a crew of about approximately 350 men, and now they've got about 1,400 crammed in the bottom of these ships. So this is not a good thing. And because of security concerns, no men are allowed to assist the prisoners, but they do allow a humanitarian by the name of Elizabeth Bergen to bring the prisoners food, some sort of supplies, comfort, etc. So they do allow her to go down there. Now you've got to keep in mind, when I explain these conditions, that these prisoners are not a real big threat, I don't think, to overthrow the ship, so to speak. You know what I mean? Because they're in bad condition. I'll give you some examples. Miss Bergen, when she goes down for the first time to try to help these prisoners of war, she is just horrified by the conditions in which they're held. I'll give you 3 examples. You know what they're fed? Undercooked meat with wormy bread. Not all that appealing. Okay, undercooked meat is not good for you anyway, and then the bread that they're giving that with that meat is full of worms. So they have undercooked meat with wormy bread. Because of that type of thing, what's going to be rampant among the prisoners? Sickness and disease. Sickness and disease are rampant. Okay, you got 1,400 people down below a ship that's meant for 350. They don't have any good food. Water's not that great. The bread's wormy. And let me give you an idea of how bad the ventilation was down there. They couldn't even light a candle because there was not enough oxygen in there to keep it burning. So can you imagine being sealed basically below deck of a ship, 4 times the capacity of what it's supposed to be almost, eating undercooked meat and wormy bread, people around you, if not you, full of disease and sickness. And there's so little ventilation, there's so little oxygen down there to breathe, that you can't even light a candle for light without it going out. Okay, that's how bad it was. Well, what do you think resulted because of these horrific conditions? Death, very good. And there were 16 ships, right, anchored in the East River, and they estimated that as many as 10 to 12 men died daily on each ship. 10 to 12 men died daily on each ship. So you look at 10 men times 16 ships, that's anywhere from 160 to almost 200 men a day that are dying, okay? Picture this in your mind. Each morning when the prisoners either wake up or begin their day, it begins with the same grim command from a British guard saying, quote, "Rebels, turn out your dead." What are they asking the rebels to do? Bring the dead out from the bottom of the ship and get them on deck. Because what are they going to do with them, Luke? They're going to bury them. Okay? So the dead were taken off the ships daily and buried right on the shoreline. And who buried them? Volunteers. Lucky prisoners of war who eagerly volunteered to bury them because it gave them a chance to do what? Get out of that ship and get some fresh air, if nothing else. Exercise. Can you imagine being crammed in there? You think they were up and down, walking around all the time? They were probably laying down and sitting most of the time. Can you imagine that? For hours upon hours. So, many prisoners eagerly volunteered for burial duty. It was much better than being on the ships. Now, did they have to? Is there any way they could have gotten off that ship, do you think? Any way they could have gotten off that ship? Walked right off. What would be the only way you can think of that the British would allow them to get off that ship and walk off? What? Be a traitor. Very good. They were given the opportunity. If you would pledge your allegiance to the king and join the British Navy, we'll let you out right now. They were given that opportunity to turn traitor. Very good, Jordy. So each prisoner was given the opportunity to join the British Navy and swear their allegiance to the king. If they did that, they would be immediately set free. There isn't any documented proof of any prisoner of war taking advantage of that. Not one. There's no documentation that says anyone did. They all subjected themselves to an agonizing death in some cases rather than turn traitor. That's pretty admirable when you think about it. Not sure. You think about yourself. If that was the conditions you were under, would you not be tempted to say, okay, I'll do that, right? Maybe someone couldn't think much less of you if you did under those conditions, although in those days being a traitor was not a good thing. Well, what about the possibility of escape? That's going to be nearly impossible, incredibly risky, and they're probably not strong enough to even do it, right? So they're going to have some help from the outside if they're going to escape at all. Who's going to be this help from the outside? Elizabeth Bergen. Now, this is kind of a crazy story, but this is what she did. She smuggled in drugs, basically, and she would cut out the pages of a book, and you'll see this in the video, and stuck the vial of drugs in the book. And she took books in to the prisoners and said, please read this. Even Bibles, and they would respond by saying, I'm not a man of faith. Well, it'll do you some good. Read it anyway. Well, they open up the book, and there's a vial of drugs inside the book, and instructions to put that drug in the British office or British guards' beer at midnight, because that's what they drank. And they had a person that was guarding each ship. They didn't have a lot of people guarding these ships because these people were in such pitiful condition. They didn't expect any kind of a revolt, so they were had their guard down. So what these prisoners would do is they'd take these drugs in this vial that Elizabeth Bergen had given them, and while the guard wasn't looking, they would put that in his beer, and what would he do? He would drink it and then basically pass out, right? Well, they would take his keys, which he had on him, they would open up the hatch to the deck, and Elizabeth Bergen would have some Patriot supporters there in the East River, and they would row those prisoners of war to safety. She actually did this. Now, sooner or later, what? What? She's going to get caught. Although she doesn't get captured, they figure it out, right? Now, they say, the estimates are that she probably saved the lives of around 200 prisoners of war, which is, when you find out the death rate, I'm going to tell you in a minute, it's not much, but it was 200 more than otherwise. Okay? So, as a result of her successful endeavor, about 200 men were rescued before she was discovered by British officials. The British were so mad at her, kiddos, they put a price on her head. What does that mean, Kate? I put a price on your head. The reason they say price on your head is what they used to do to people in medieval times when they execute, what they used to do. Beheaded, right? So if you put a price on your head, I'm going to give somebody so much money to kill you, basically, or bring you in so I can kill you. Okay, they were so upset. And that price was 200 British pounds. 200 British pounds is what they were going to give us a reward. Now, anybody know how much that would be back in those days? Anybody want to take a guess how much money? I'll tell you this first, which will amaze you. It would take a British soldier, just an infantry soldier, 20 years to earn 200 British pounds. But anyway, to make a long story short, at that period of time, 20 British pounds was $264.13. You know what that would be in today's dollars? About $4,800. Okay? So, they offered a price on her head of 200 pounds, and that was more than a British soldier could earn in 20 years of service. Well, she never was captured. She escaped from New York, and George Washington was so impressed with her that he gave her a military pension for the rest of her life after the Revolutionary War ended because of her valiant service to this country. So after we win the Revolutionary War, George Washington is so impressed that he gives her a military pension. Okay? Now, That's final thought on prisoners of war. We're ahead of ourselves a little bit, but they estimated that the number of American soldiers killed in action in the Revolutionary War were somewhere between 8,000 and 8,500. That's how many were killed in battle, okay? During this entire course of the war, which we haven't finished. Anybody want to guess how many prisoners of war died during that same period of time? 8,000 to 8,500 American soldiers were killed in action, while they were fighting in battle during the course of the Revolutionary War. How many prisoners of war died during that same time? Anybody want to guess? What's that? 5,000? Not a bad guess. Would you think there more would die in prison camps than died in battle? You probably wouldn't think that, would you? But 12,000 prisoners of war died. More prisoners of war died, substantially more prisoners of war died on those 16 British ships that were actually killed in action during this time. Isn't that kind of hard to believe? I think it's incredibly hard to believe. Okay, I'm going to tell you about one more subtopic and then we're going to watch the video. And the next subtopic is continued American failure in the South. Continued American failure in the South. Not doing very good, are we? Have we won a battle in the South yet that I've mentioned?
Yes.
Which one?
Moore Street.
Yeah, way early. Very good. We did win that one. But since the wars come to the South, have we won any? No, we haven't won any. Matter of fact, we're losing battle after battle after battle. And I'm going to give you an example of when we lose and why it was somewhat self-inflicted. What does that mean? Do it to yourself, okay? So, the battle we're going to talk about that was self-inflicted was the Battle of Camden. And the Battle of Camden happened in South Carolina on August 16th of 1780. So one of these battles we lost in the South, self-inflicted, in other words, we kind of did it to ourselves, was the Battle of Camden. And that happened in South Carolina on August 16th of 1780. Now, we actually went on the offensive here. It was our attack against the British, and we had about 4,000 American soldiers that attacked about 2,500 British soldiers at the Battle of Camden. So we were on the offensive here. We were pushing, and the British were on the defensive. We attacked them. We had 4,000, they had 2,500. By now, the Southern fight in the Revolutionary War, the British are under the command of Charles Cornwallis. That's who's running the British troops in the South, is Charles Cornwallis. So, at the Battle of Camden, American forces are going to fight against British forces who are under the command of Charles Cornwallis. Okay? Now, you'd think that we might have a chance to win, because why? We have more soldiers. Well, something kind of interesting happened the day before the battle. Our American soldiers were quite hungry, some starving, hadn't been eaten in quite a while, and they ran onto this great big lot of peaches. And they just totally devoured this big supply of peaches the day before the battle. What was the matter with these peaches, you think, Tatum? Well, they might have been, let's say they were sparkling clean. What else might be the matter with them? They're either this or that. They're either rotten or they are too ripe. And they were too ripe. And they just devoured these ripe peaches. What happens to you if you eat ripe fruit in excess? What part of your body just goes bad? Stomach, which can lead to throwing up, can lead to diarrhea, can lead to all kinds of problems. Well, they eat these peaches, Carter, the day before the battle. Well, during that 24 hours, guess what happens as they begin this battle? They're all sick, deadly ill, stomach issues, cramps, diarrhea, who knows what. Which definitely affects the outcome, and because of the fact that we self-inflicted defeat, we're going to lose this Battle of Camden, and half of those Patriot forces, 2,000, are going to be killed, wounded, or captured. So we lose this battle at Camden not so much because we weren't better fighters or didn't hang in there, but these unripe peaches made us incredibly sick, affected us in many adverse ways, and helped lead the British to a victory. Well, that's not the end of the story, because as we are retreating, the colonial soldiers are retreating from Camden. Their goal is to pick up as much American rifles and ammunition and cannons as they can on their retreat. Why do they want to pick all this stuff up? So the British doesn't get it. So that was kind of what you could vision as the colonial soldiers were retreating. They desperately tried to pick up as much equipment as possible because they didn't want to fall in the hands of the British. Now, who was among those men that was picking up this equipment? Anybody know? Somebody in here should. What? Did you do the report on it? Who did the report on Peter Francisco? You did. So who comes into mind here? What did Peter Francisco do at the Battle of Camden? What did you write about it? It's okay. Maybe you've got stuff I'm going to say later. Let me continue while you look and you tell me if this rings a bell. Well, one of the men that's picking up this equipment is Peter Francisco, better known to people that knew him as the Virginia Giant. You know why they called him the Virginia Giant, Tatum? Did you do the right? I'm sure you did. You know what the average size of an American man was? Well, maybe he'll talk. Maybe 5'8", 5'9", about 165 pounds in those days. We didn't get really big until later. He was 6'6", 280. 6'6", 280, Peter Francisco. And he's among these men that are picking up equipment. He's known as the Virginia Giant because of his unusual size. He stood 6'6", weighed about 280 pounds. And do you know what he did now? He refreshed up.
I know that you went in to a British fort during the night and you got kind of hand on that.
Oh, he was kind of a tough bugger?
Yeah.
Okay, well let me tell the story and then we'll go from there. Well, according to accounts of the retreat of Camden, he decided he was going to pick up one of the cannons because he didn't want the cannon to be in British hands. And according to research, that cannon weighed 1,100 pounds. And he picked up that cannon and he hoisted that cannon on his shoulder and packed it out of the battle. Now, George Washington later was so impressed with Peter Francisco that he called him a one-man army. Called him a one-man army. Now, obviously, this guy probably wasn't American or British because of what? His size. I mean, that was unusual. And he was kind of a mystery. Peter Francisco was kind of a mystery. No one really knows why or how he ended up in America. People believe he came to America from Portugal. That's where they thought he came from. Immigrated in from Portugal. The point being is he was a fearless and ferocious fighter. And you've only heard the early part of the story. He will come back into being here and help the Americans redeem themselves in a later battle. Okay? But in the Battle of Camden, he was noticed as picking up an 1,100-pound cannon and carrying it off so the British would not get it. But we'll talk about him a little bit later. Okay? All right, what we're going to do then is we're going to watch the video up to this point and see if what I'm saying makes sense. I'm guessing it might.